Yeah, we're back here with the uh, election war media. We call it "It's Always Shady" in Chicago. And we're giving you, a little bit of information and perspective on the elections coming up. Already we're doing uh, early voting in Chicago, but the official date is February 20th. In the city, and a lot of things to talk about with this election, and we're glad to have a very well-informed, and journalist columnist here on us tonight, and an educator who was educated some of our great people here at WARR Media, Mr. John Fountain, with us. Uh, John, great to speak with you.
Thank you.
Really admired your work for years. Chicago Times. Yes, yeah, and so I think to unfortunately you're not there anymore. We'll talk that in a little bit, but you still, I see you still doing a lot of writing on a platform, but you've been in many platforms, beyond sometimes, New York Times and whatnot, and you've really done a lot of work here in Chicago, speaking to important issues and speaking the truth, and really informing a lot of our electorate here in Chicago, our community. Just and like I said, we got Saul here, and you taught him at Roosevelt University. Producer Saul, who's done so much for us here, and another one of our collaborators throughout the years, one of our really key guys, Josh Hicks. You've educated him as well. So I really appreciate the work that you do with them. You're like a better mentor even than I am. So
Thank you.
like a so I really haven't had to do much as far as in leading myself, because you've done so much, I think, in teaching. But Saul is, you guys have spoken a lot in your classes about the election and about local journalism here in Chicago. So, starting off on that level, what are your thoughts overall on how this mayoral is up so far, though the combatants and just the state of the city right now as it heads into this latest election?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me. And I appreciate and am grateful for your platform. It is important, as I always say, and I find myself saying increasingly more, that we have to have independent voices that are not necessarily linked to big media to share their thoughts and ideas, because there is not a monolith, even among men of color. We don't all speak and think the same. So I will say that, I've heard it said that in Chicago, this is a critical time, a very critical election. Chicago has some issues like other major cities around this nation. And one of the issues that the candidates continue to talk about, and some think that because Chicago happens to not be in the top 10 in terms of crime per capita, or I should say murder per capita, that it is not the murder capital of America, that the candidates are over-speaking in terms of talking about violence and their intention to address it. But I think one of the things that I know as a former crime reporter is in the city of Chicago, once the Chicago Tribune's chief crime reporter, is that the way they calculate the murder rate in cities is a misnomer for the city of Chicago. What I mean by that is they measure murder, the number of murders, by largely the overall population. That's not the way to do it, because we know that Chicago is indeed a tale of two cities, that you can live in one Chicago that never sees shooting or rarely sees shootings, rarely sees homicides, does not see bodies and brain matter and blood on the streets. But you go to another part of Chicago where I grew up on the west side of Chicago in K-Town, and I'm not putting it down. I'm just speaking about the reality of life in Inglewood, Chicago, the life in North Lawndale, Chicago, or East Garfield or West Garfield or Austin, Chicago. And it's a different picture. And so we've got to have someone who is not only talking a good game, but I think walking the walk and coming up with a comprehensive plan to address violence that does not just point the finger at police, at the police chief, but seeks to build community, seeks to, I don't know if there was ever a great relationship between the African-American community and the police, because I'm old enough to remember as a boy the killing of Fred Hampton and Mark Clark. I'm old enough to remember that we saw young Black men being beaten and being abused by police officers long before there was video. And so I think there has to be some trust built up, but I think there are other issues like economic issues. And so, you know, the race has really come down to, there are 9 candidates in the race, but it seems that it's come down to a kind of a three-headed monster, or at least a race between the top 3 candidates. There was a recent poll that was conducted last week for Northwestern University and a coalition of Latino and Black nonprofits, and it shows Paul Vallis leading with 19%. He's followed by Chuy Garcia at 17% and Lori Lightfoot at 14%, Willie Wilson at 12%, but still more than 20% with a couple of weeks to go in this election before voters get to go to the polls and make a decision. There's still 20% of voters who remain undecided. So it's an important race, and I think you know, I feel a little hypocritical because I no longer live in Chicago, so I don't get to vote. But I am still a social commentator and an observer, because and I have a vested interest, because I think the way Chicago goes, Chicago's suburbs go as well.
No, yeah, you're 100%. And again, thanks for coming on, Professor. Really appreciate it. But you know, we always talk about it in class, where we talk a lot about with journalism in class and how it impacts the city of Chicago. How does this election, in your eyes, impact journalism? And it even, as you said, you know, people of color as well. You know, it's important, but just in general, as a whole, how will it impact?
I think that whoever the next mayor of the city of Chicago is, I don't think you can overemphasize the importance of their role at this time in the history of the city of Chicago. I remember growing up on the West Side, and there was a sense that if I went downtown the city of Chicago, that there were things that happened on the West Side in terms of crime that did not happen downtown. That never seemed quite right. And I'm reminded of a saying that you can't control chaos. And injustice anywhere, as Dr. King would say, is a threat to justice everywhere. So I think that Chicago, the mayor, has to address this issue of violence, has to address not only the issue of violence, but the issue of Chicago public schools, whether it is educating the children of the city of Chicago, because there still is a direct correlation between incarceration and illiteracy. And if the children can't read, then it shows that the statistics show they're more likely to be involved in gangs, more likely to be involved in crime, more likely to go to prison. And so the education is not just it isn't a pipe dream. It is the American dream. It is a tool to give people a way to extricate themselves from poverty. And I know many people who do that. I don't speak just as a professor, but as a pragmatic, as someone who held on to that idea of education. But I think that, however this turns out, when I look at the city of Chicago, the mayor is African American, the Cook County Board president is African American, the state's attorney is African American, the attorney general, Illinois Attorney General, is African American, and so we have key people of color, African Americans, in key positions. But I think that isn't enough. And here I'm going to really segue to journalism. I think that in terms of the stories and the issues that that affect us all across the city of Chicago and beyond, they have to be told by people who look like those folks. And what I mean is that newsrooms have to become more diverse. In 1968, the Kerner Report Kerner Commission issued its report on the previous year of riots across America. And one of the things they did was they pointed the finger directly at the media. And they said the media it has no blacks in the newsroom. It has few people of color. And in order to create a more wholesome picture, a more accurate picture of what life is like for those who live on the other side of the tracks, who live beyond the Gold Coast, who live on what I call the Cold Coast, on hyper segregated isles, high poverty, high crime. We have to, I think, tell those stories. And I think that the media has got to do a better job to get at this. And it's all a part of, I think, making the city better and creating for all of us a greater democracy.
John, going off of that, I'm glad you mentioned that and the Kerner report, and it goes right into a piece that I saw that you wrote recently on subject. Where are the Black voices in my hometown newspaper? Speaking specifically times, and they made, I think, the wrong-headed decision to let you go late last year, and it seemed I would guess, given the fact that I was let go from traditional outlet well, and I see the way that they typically act when they let go people, especially because don't replacements that come that let people like us go. So, in that piece, you start off mentioning this sort of American call for the next columnist, in the Sun Times, and I just want you to speak, more about your thoughts on the future of that newspaper and maybe journalism as a whole here in Chicago, and the way that, in many ways they are failing, because you look at brothers like Saul, it's an uphill climb for us to maintain and for people like us to be really whole as journalists here in this town right now, and really able to do work that we know we can do, but it doesn't seem to be valued. It seems to be more about creating the next personality who can get you, more clicks that that you want to get online, or go out and get the most subscriptions you can get, whatever, or cross over TV and get ratings that way. But it's not really about getting real journalists prepared and really put out there to do the work that is needed in a contentious town like Chicago.
Yes. Well, great question. And before I tackle it, let me clarify one point. They didn't let me go. I let them go. I set myself free.
Oh, excuse me.
And so when I say it's 50 cents a word, my Substack, Diary of a Freed Black Journalist, I will tell you that in brief that the current executive editor at the Sun-Times came in, and who has never edited my column in the 13 years that I've been there. And actually on the weekend that I filed this column was about another former student of mine, Aaron Lee. And I wrote the story. Aaron, of course, had passed away after presenting his documentary and making it back to Chicago as a producer for ESPN. I wasn't able to attend Aaron's funeral. And so I knew that at some point I was going to do a piece about Aaron in memorial, in tribute to him. And so I wrote the piece, and mind you, I've written controversial things for the Sun-Times. They all got in, there was no issue. And just on this weekend, my editor, who was normally there, was on vacation, and he told me to file my story directly to the executive editor. Now, mind you, I've been a journalist for 40 years. I have never seen an executive editor edit a columnist story ever in my life. I was a young reporter at the Chicago Tribune once upon a time, when someone mistakenly, or someone, I'll call it a mistake, they had edited Mike Royko's column and changed it. And Mike Royko called up to the desk, and he was cursing mad. And his words, with with some words I cannot utter, "Don't you ever touch my column again." That is not my demeanor. But the editor said to me, she sent me 2 versions of my column and said, and she edited, wholesale edited, changed things, used her own words. And a column is different from writing a feature story. I've written feature stories that have been on the front page of the Washington Post and the front page of the New York Times, that have been in Washington Post, the lead story in the Washington Post Sunday magazine, and on the front page of Washington Post Sunday Outlook section. I've written stories that have appeared on the front pages of newspapers across this country. I've written 5 books. I know how to write. And this was a simple story. And I tried to tell her, look, the reason I constructed it this way is because I wanted to draw the reader in. I didn't want to give all the information away right away. And she said to me, well, we should change it. I care about the reader. I'm looking out for the reader. And I'm thinking, I've been here for 13 years, and I didn't say that. I'm very calm. As a matter of fact, my voice at this point right now is much more elevated than my voice was with the editor. And she said, well, you have 3 choices. We can run either the 2 versions of your column that I gave you, or you can take another stab at it. I said, I'm not going to do either. And she says, well, we're not going to run it. And I said, I resign. Because as a columnist, my words have to be my own. As a Black man in America, who happens to also to be a Black journalist, my words definitely have to be my own. And I say that, to your question, this idea of being a journalist, a person of color in a newsroom that is predominantly white, even though my journalistic pedigree is, I have an undergraduate degree in journalism, I have a graduate degree in journalism, I've been a Michigan Journalism Fellow, I've been to the University of California, Berkeley, to the Knight Digital Multimedia Center, I'm a Fulbright Scholar, I've written 5 books, I had 6 internships before I ever got my first job, newspapers across this country. I've got the journalism pedigree, but every time I walked into a newsroom, I know that there were people there, it is the truth, that they treated me, looked at me as if I were an imposter. And so that has to change. And if it doesn't change in American journalism and mainstream American journalism, then they are continuing to dwell in their own hypocrisy. Because you don't have to leave an American newsroom to figure out how race has lived in America. Just write about the newsroom. That's how race has lived in America. How the newsrooms in America, mainstream newsrooms, are a reflection of the segregation, a reflection of the racism that exists in America. Let's just deal with that and tell the truth. That said, Saul knows that I preach. It is important to maintain your voice as an independent journalist. And we have vehicles now that allow us to do that, to tell our own stories through our own perspectives that are no more jaded than the perspectives that we hear coming from mainstream media sources, whether it's CNN or the New York Times or the Washington Post. That is their version, their selection of what news is important today for us. But they don't get to decide. We get to decide what's important for us. And so it's important for us to find ways to continue to be a voice, to continue to tell those stories. And that was a long answer for a very astute question. I apologize for rambling.
It was a perfect answer, John, and I really appreciate that you said that and that you laid out your story, for the record about what happened with the Sun Times because it deserved to be your position deserved to be heard. And it's I couldn't agree with you more with everything that you said, and you know I want to thank you, but we're gonna have to keep it moving for our final segment. I want to thank you that very much for first off for appearing with us and for the work that you've done throughout your 4 years of journalism and that you continue to do. You're definitely someone who deserves to be held up and as a great example of what it means to be black and be in this journalism game. And I wish you the best. Like I said, you still have your platforms that you're utilizing to your best, starting with your Substack site. And if you could just let our audience know about that, about your Substack, and however else they could follow you and support your work, we appreciate that.
Well, if they go to johnwfountain.substack.com or just johnwfountain.com, it'll lead you to the Substack. And as I say to some folks sometimes, just Google me. I'm here. I'm out there. I ain't stopping. And I just want to say one last thing. One saying that I carried throughout my career. Don Terry is a former New York Times reporter. Last I heard, Don was working in the mayor's office. I don't know where he is now, but at a very difficult time in journalism, I called Don up and I said, "Hey man, how do you deal with this mess as a black reporter?" And Don's first 4 words out of his mouth were, "Never internalize their disrespect." And let me tell you, through my career, I have evolved. And there is another saying that has come to me: not only never internalize their disrespect, but never accept their disrespect. Never.
Definitely. We will definitely take those words to heart. Saul, you got anything you want to say? I know you'll see him again pretty soon. So
but oh yeah. Very well said, Professor. And yeah, thank you for coming on. I'm sure we'll have you on at some other time as well to talk Chicago as well. And yeah, hopefully everything turns out well for both journalism and just Chicago in general.
Yes, indeed. You guys keep doing what you're doing.